Antichrist Superstar was the second studio album released by American rock band Marilyn Manson, one of my favourite bands and one of my favourite albums. I'm not big into music, and there are only a select few musicians that I regularly listen to, and that's probably because it's rare that music really speaks to me. Part of the reason why I love Marilyn Manson, and I'm going to refer to him in the singular when specifically talking about the frontman, the only consistent member of the band over the years, is that his lyrics, songs and albums, even his tours, have built up a level of mythology I rarely see in other musicians. He's like a series of books or movies, building a new aesthetic and world with each album, and a new philosophy and meaning with each list of songs. There's so much to dissect and interpret, so much imagery and symbolism, and so many references to other media, that you could write a whole video essay dissecting just one of his albums. So that's what I'm here to do. Antichrist Superstar released in 1996, it was notably produced by Nine Inch Nails frontman Trent Reznor, who'd previously produced the band's debut album, Portrait of an American Family, and all of its lyrics were written solely by the frontman, with the exception of track 1. It's a concept album, meaning it ain't just a collection of disparate songs, rather, it's a single entity, and it's the first instalment of what Manson would call his triptych, a trilogy of albums that continued with Mechanical Animals and concluded with Holywood. This video will be split into sections because there's a lot to cover. I'll start by going through the track list, reviewing each of the songs in turn and exploring the basic meaning behind the lyrics. I'll also highlight some of my favourite lyrics from certain songs. Then I'll give some background on the album, including the style it conveys with its choice of genre and aesthetic, its evolution from the previous album, Portrait of an American Family, its major sources of inspiration, and the narrative woven through its songs. I'll follow this by mapping the narrative across the album's structure. Then I'll add to this by exploring the music videos attached to the album, giving an overview of the Dead to the World tour that supported it, and even taking a closer look at elements of the packaging and artwork included with the physical release. The final section will be a roundup of my thoughts on the album's overall themes and messages. The timecodes are listed here on the screen for easier navigation. First, I'll review each song on the album with some focus on certain lyrics. Full of buzzwords meant to piss people off, but without feeling cheap or exploitative about it. As Manson sings in the chorus, "Fuck it," he's going to start the album by telling us how he really feels, and he's going to be loud about it. He refers to selling suicides and seeing abortions in his eyes, conflating these things with America and totalitarianism, but also talks of raping rapists and killing everyone so God can deal with them. He also uses particularly strong language to imply that every human is a slave to someone else, including himself, which is a highly profound statement that highlights the power dynamics of capitalist society. The guitars are fuzzy and right up front, and it sounds like there could be dozens of guitar tracks layered on top of each other. The fuzziness of the instruments gives the song more character than it just being loud and hard to decipher, allowing the vocals to float to the top of the cacophony, where heavy and loaded language is being used to emphasize the real message. The song opens like a rally being hosted by an evil computer, and I especially like the extra drums behind the final post-chorus. Here are my favourite lyrics. An obvious choice, but this is my favourite Marilyn Manson song ever. The thumping, rally-like drums, flanked by dull hammering bass and echoing keyboards. It's great, though the slightly reworked version of the track, included on the 2004 compilation album Lest We Forget, has the keyboards much louder. And I think I prefer the song that way. There are these weird swirling noises floating around somewhere behind all the other stuff, which are atmospheric and kinda spooky. It's an industrial classic, and together with the opening song, it spells out Marilyn Manson's original mission statement with such confidence. The lyrics remind us that humans are animals who have not evolved beyond that, evoking Nietzsche's take on evolution as an intellectual and philosophical process. Here are my favourite lyrics. Like a robotic, experimental hip-hop song with its bouncing, throbbing beat and scratchy drums, guitars and feedback. Certain lines are emphasised by an organ, or at least a keyboard imitating an organ. And that acoustic bridge makes for a nice breather from 3 songs in a row of overpowering loudness. The layering on this track is inspired, and the thumping guitar over the outro goes hard. I feel like the lyrics are describing an idol or martyr like Christ, and here are my favourites. A grungier, bass-driven song that's very melodic, and yet it has these weird tonal guitars that remind me of the music of saxophonist Colin Stetson. The guitar fades way into the back during the first verse, but you can still hear it humming away, which is something I only really noticed just this time around. It has a great pace to it. Manson's songs usually follow a conventional lyrical structure, but often they'll do so without falling into the traps that lesser musicians can with that basic structure. The songs here keep a very engaging pace, especially this one, which almost feels like a ballad. The vocals here are particularly venomous, giving the already personal lyrics even more intimacy, and I can picture Manson in the studio standing 6 feet away from the microphone and yelling at it. The lyrics impart a feeling of being scapegoated, and here are my favourites. Just like the opening track, this song feels kind of like an invocation, like you could conjure up a demon if you played it too loud. Appropriate, considering the entire song is a reference to Daniel 7 from the Old Testament, in which Daniel dreams of 4 beasts rising from the earth, 4 omens of doom. I appreciate how fleeting this song is, not concerning itself with the 3 to 4 minute standard song length, because it can still get its point across in that short runtime. It's minor, but worth a listen. I like the grim guitar riffs and the rapid percussion, and the lyrics are evocative. Here's my favourite. One of the most interesting songs on the album from a structural and instrumental perspective. Structurally, it feels more like a poem than a conventional song. Instrumentally, the percussion consists of a metronome-like ticking and the dull sound of a heartbeat, imparting a feeling of emptiness on the listener. There's actually a lot of layering going on in this song, but it still feels like we're listening to a barren black and white wasteland thanks to the subtle ambient tones floating around. I also like the vocoded vocals over the end, which manage to sound completely non-human without being obnoxious about it. The lyrics evoke the metamorphosis of the album's protagonist, from an innocent child to a horrible monster, and here are my favourites. I haven't much to say about this song other than it reminds me of something off Mechanical Animals, kind of bouncy and techno sounding. It's fun to listen to, but lyrically not as piercing as other songs on the album. I like the heavy guitars towards the 3-minute mark. More like a garage punk song than anything. In other words, it sounds like a holdover or maybe a demo from the previous album, which is only a minor issue. It still works though, it's playful and uncontrolled and has a more tongue-in-cheek, punkish attitude. Even the vocals are haphazard. Don't pick the scabs or you will never heal. But all of this gives the song its own personality and helps it stand out from the woe and misery of the rest of the album. I only just noticed, on my most recent listen, that the drums, in stark contrast to the anthemic and rhythmic stomping beats of the rest of the album, are kind of playful and quirky on this track. The lyrics cover the same ground as Crypt Orchid, though, and less effectively than that track. From the moment this song begins, there's something sinister and devilish about its tone. What's interesting is the way this song builds and builds, stepping up with new instrument tracks every so often, layering guitars at first, then drums, and so on. There's a buzzing static over the guitar just before the first verse, but it comes in and out with hard cuts, which is more subtly aggressive than just soft fading. The sudden step up in instrumentation during the chorus pulls the song right out of its quieter, more restrained verses, again making the song feel violent. The lyrics cover the same ground as Deformography, but I like this particular one. We're back in incantation territory. This song is a hardcore, demonic ritual whose lyrics welcome the destructive new form of the protagonist. My only issue is that I wish it was louder. The earth-crumbling guitar riffs are too quiet, and this is a song that benefits from being played live, where the guitars can be weightier and more upfront. Nevertheless, those fuzzy guitars return from the first track, but there's something darker and deeper about them this time. I also like how the vocals have this extra effect around them, which means we can clearly hear when they cut in and out. Like the guitars in the previous song, the vocals feel more jarring as a result, which is a good thing. The lyrics for this song are from the perspective of a child, more obviously than any previous songs. The vocals emphasise this, as Manson's voice cracks and strains a lot. This is an emotionally heavy song from the content of the lyrics and the strained vocals, and the unrelenting bass is an exclamation mark that reminds you of that. The protagonist takes the name Disintegrator and turns against those who abuse him, becoming an object of fear. The instrumentation during the middle 8 starts to drown out the bass, which I think is the most important instrument of the song and should have been kept right at the front of the mix the whole time, sharing space with the other tracks rather than being drowned by them. This track sounds like a satanic engine starting up, and I love that songs can evoke imagery like that with sound alone. Here are my favourite lyrics. I described some of the other songs as invocations or incantations. This song is a rally anthem, a stadium song complete with the sounds of a cheering crowd at certain points. If the other songs were incantations to summon a demon, then this is the song you play to trigger the end of the world. The previous songs about metamorphosis culminate with this track. The guitar tracks are ruthlessly stacked up and flattened into a wall of rhythmic buzzing, and the keyboards during the choruses are epic. The chorus samples throughout the song create the atmosphere of a church, appropriate for the invocation of the Antichrist, and I do wonder if those samples were taken from the film Begotten, which Manson claims to have had playing on a loop during the studio recordings. Here are my favourite lyrics. Lyrically speaking, this is my least favourite song. The lyrics feel like a string of inflammatory words without rhyme or reason, which is fine, but not too imaginative. The instruments are good though, with subtle rhythmic bass, shredding guitars during the choruses, clanging keyboards, and pacey drums. It's fun to listen to, and despite their limitations, there are some good lyrics dotted around. Here's an example. Like Kinderfeld before it, the bass on this track is right in your ears. It's like the sound of misery, dull and shapeless. And it's contrasted nicely at times with these razor-sharp, distorted guitars. Manson's vocals here are some of his best. He's at his most honest and naked, and as with Tourniquet, I can picture him yelling some of them from across the sound booth. That jangling keyboard that recurs throughout is sinister, and an especially nice touch that adds some character. Here are some favourite lyrics. Instrumentally, quite simple, but that's fine. The vocals are nice and sharp, and its sparse use of instruments or layering means there are no distractions from the lyrics. The chorus, by the way, is fantastic. The lyrics, the vocals, the instruments, everything. The lyrics refer to LaVeyan Satanism as the protagonist constructs himself as God. Something worth mentioning is that acoustic bridge that sounds like a snippet from a live show, complete with a cheering audience and the kind of echoes you only get with a live performance. It's strange. It sounds like an artifact from the live shows that came after the album's release, like it was brought back in time to the present to be dropped into the album, with no explanation. It's spooky, actually. Here are my favourite lyrics. The closing song of the record is also the slowest and most laid back, driven at first by soft piano and slow drums. It's like a funeral march to mark the end of the album, that or it's marking the death of the human race in the Armageddon, as the protagonist reflects on how he got to where he is now. It's full of sorrow and regret, despite the vitriol and spite of the previous songs. Those whining guitars that pop up now and again are like something out of a western, and distortion begins to seep in as the song goes on, reminding us that there is a purpose here. This isn't just a sad piano ballad, and it breaks down into chaos during the last couple of minutes. A computer voice fades in and takes over, reminding us of the album's opening moments. Here are my favourite lyrics. Worth mentioning here is track 99, the hidden track which contains backmasked vocals and the same computer voice from the opening track. If the album is played on a loop, track 99 will lead seamlessly into the beginning of the album. Time for some background. Antichrist Superstar's genre is usually described as industrial metal or industrial rock, but what does that mean? I never quite understood what the term industrial meant in relation to music, but it's basically another way of saying experimental music that's still music and not just noise. Wikipedia defines industrial as a fusion of genres like electronic and punk rock music, but also cites noise music, avant-garde, and performance art as influences, making industrial essentially a more ambitious and provocative genre than most others. Industrial will experiment with controversial aesthetic and lyrical themes, as well as synthesizers and experimental electronic elements and samples from other sources. The band's previous album has also been described as industrial, but I think it leans more heavily into straight-up punk with its cartoonish, in-your-face attitude and lyrics that twist childish imagery and cartoon characters into nightmarish alternatives. Where Portrait uses its more industrial elements to be cartoonish and goofy, but in a spooky way, Antichrist uses industrial stylings to create an aesthetic of occultism, ritual, and destruction in the mind of the listener. The lyrical content and use of sound evokes a barren wasteland stalked by cavemen and monsters, and is a huge step towards what I believe is the band's true mission statement. Where Portrait was designed to shock and spook its listeners, Antichrist is designed to assault and terrify its listeners, conveying its messages only to those who are willing to listen. I don't mean to criticise Portrait, but I do believe Antichrist is the far superior album, more focused and coherent, and more scathing a criticism of the world. A huge inspiration for Antichrist Superstar was Manson's own childhood. Despite being raised in a Christian environment with an Episcopal mother and a Catholic father, young Brian Warner would strive to explore the things that were forbidden to him, and learned about some of his grandfather's deviant sexual fetishes, which he and his wife kept very private. His grandparents were particularly strict in their methods of discipline, and weren't afraid to punish Brian. Brian felt shunned by his family as he grew older, and recalled his cousin and childhood friend Chad's wedding in his autobiography, The Long Hard Road Out of Hell. He'd felt uncomfortable around his family at the wedding, and was inspired by the ceremony to write the album's closing song, Man That You Fear. He'd realised that the innocent and naive child he once was, who sought only to be loved by the people around him, had grown into a man that was feared and avoided by those same people. This inspired the album's narrative, which I'll come back to. Another major influence was the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, more specifically his concept of the Übermensch, or Overman, which Nietzsche described as the terminus point of human evolution. Humanity in its current state is a halfway point in the evolution from the animalistic, instinct-driven apes to the self-determining, self-overcoming Overman. This evolution, from a lowly animal to a simple everyman to an ultimate superhuman form, is also represented by the narrative of the album. So let's talk about the narrative. It's simple, really, and should be understood in broad brushstrokes rather than taken literally. The lyrics of the album are imprecise and, in my opinion, only vaguely reflect the narrative woven through the songs, so you'd do better to keep the narrative in mind and not expect a clear storyline. Simply put, the album tells the story of a lowly but supernatural character called the Worm as he undergoes a process of metamorphosis, first achieving a celebrity status and a devoted following, which he uses to make himself a prophet. In the end, he becomes the Antichrist in order to exterminate the human race. Clearly, this is a darker and less optimistic take on Nietzsche's understanding of human evolution, as the worm evolves into a superhuman only to destroy the human race, and not simply to improve himself and become better than he was. Manson's journey from childhood to adulthood is also reflected in the narrative, as the worm represents the perceptions Manson's family had of him. The worm is diminutive and pathetic, someone who's easy to control, brainwash, and punish. But the Antichrist is destructive and fearsome, someone who brings about the end times. As a child, Manson was raised by a strict family and punished for breaking the rules, but as an adult, he was something to fear. For the child, Brian Warner, this would have been a failure, but for the adult Marilyn Manson, this was a victory. Let's look at the structure of the album, which is divided into 3 cycles: The Hierophant, Inauguration of the Worm, and Disintegrator Rising. In terms of the narrative, I think cycles 1 and 2 might be backwards. Cycle 2 examines the protagonist's feelings of inferiority, while Cycle 1, whose title refers to a holy person who holds a congregation, seems to be examining the sermons of the worm once he has become a celebrity and begun to preach to his followers. The 3rd cycle follows the Antichrist, or Disintegrator, as he begins his final solution and destroys the human race. I think the anachronistic narrative is intentional, in the same way that a movie might show us a scene from later in the narrative, then follow the characters through the early parts of the narrative leading up to that point, before concluding with the final stages of the narrative as the situation resolves. This assessment isn't perfect, though. For example, Tourniquet might be a better fit for Cycle 2 than Cycle 1, and Angel with the Scabbed Wings might be more appropriate for cycle 1 than cycle 2. To simplify things, the tracks focusing on the tragic backstory of the worm include tracks 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11. Tracks like Tourniquet, Deformography, and Mr. Superstar come at the start, when the worm is being used and abused by those around him, while tracks like Cryptorchid and Kinderfeld come at the end of that chapter, as the worm begins to transform and turns against those same people. Second, the tracks focusing on the worm becoming the Antichrist or disintegrator and preaching to his followers include tracks 1, 2, 5, 10, and 13. The tracks Irresponsible Hate Anthem, The Beautiful People, and 1996 feel like the Antichrist sermons, while Angel with the Scabbed Wings and Little Horn chronicle a monster rising. These lead into the final chapter, whose tracks follow the disintegrator's destruction of humanity and include tracks 12, 14, 15, and 16. The track Antichrist Superstar welcomes the destruction of humanity, while the final 3 tracks of the album seem to capture the disintegrator's thoughts in the process and aftermath, as he simultaneously reflects on becoming God and becoming the last human. Let's take a quick look at some of the media supporting the album, including the music videos, the Dead to the World tour, and the artwork and booklet included with the physical release. The video for The Beautiful People was directed by Floria Sigismondi, and it's brilliant. It showcases close-up photography of medical prosthetics and apparatus throughout, as well as imagery that reminds of fascist rallies and Nazi salutes. The band are seen performing in a dilapidated, disused building, and they're all wearing these awesome costumes and makeup that somehow evoke the aesthetic of the album. At one point, Manson becomes a bald-headed, pale-faced giant that walks amongst a crowd gathered outside the building. It's a masterpiece of concept, direction, cinematography, editing, and art direction. Also directed by Sigismondi, the video for Tourniquet focuses on Manson as he walks around an old house, crawling with insects and occupied by these strange, expressionless people. Manson cuts his nails and shaves his body hair before sprouting wings and turning into a grub hanging from the wall. He's then replaced by a dressmaker's mannequin that moves around the house in stop motion. All of this indicates a transformation, but reminds us of the protagonist's frailty and weakness. It's well made, but the previous video was better. Man That You Fear's video was directed by Andrew Whiston and was inspired by elements of Alejandro Jodorowsky's art house horror movie Santa Sangre. It's more like a short film, and it tells the story of a small community living in the desert who select a character played by Manson to be taken into the wilderness and killed. It looks like he's a scapegoat for the community, and it resembles the way Manson described his family's perceptions of him as an adult, someone to be avoided or shunned. The black and white American flag and the funeral procession are visual references to Santa Sangre, which is a nice touch. It's very well made. Finally, the videos for Cryptorchid and Antichrist Superstar were both directed by E. Elias Marriage, director of another art house horror movie, Begotten. Both videos lift clips from Begotten, but include some original footage that's about as abstract and impossible to decipher as the footage shown in that movie. That style's fine for Cryptorchid, which is a shorter and more surreal song, but Antichrist Superstar is longer and could have done with more substance. The footage of Nazi parades, rallies and book burnings, and Manson standing at a podium are repetitive and unengaging. The Dead to the World tour ran from September 1996 to September 1997 and was regularly protested by conservative and Christian groups. In the live music film for the tour, Manson describes himself as a scapegoat for society's problems, reframing the protesters as desperate people looking for someone to blame for the evils they perceived in society, which they believed Manson's music was promoting. These included incest, racism and sexism, devil worship, and child rape. There were threats of legal action and statements from local mayors and state governors, prayer vigils, cancellations, run-ins with local police, and, most worryingly, there were even bomb threats. During one show in Utah, an audience member repeatedly aimed a rifle laser scope at Manson, who, unsure whether the person actually had a rifle, dared the audience member to shoot him, and stood up on the speakers on stage to give them a clearer shot. The shows would feature blatant religious imagery, and Manson would self-harm on stage, cutting himself with shards of glass and bleeding while he performed. During performances of Antichrist Superstar, Manson would stand at a podium wearing a suit, imitating televangelists like Pat Robertson while tearing pages from the Bible. The podium, as well as the flags hanging from the backdrop of the stage, were emblazoned with the album's shock logo, based on the high-voltage caution logo, in an imitation of the Nazis' Nuremberg rallies and the Nazis' use of the swastika symbol. As Manson stated on Bill Maher's talk show, Politically Incorrect, his destruction of Bibles and use of the American flag to wipe his arse during his shows was intended to challenge people's assumptions that these symbols are inherently sacred, and to emphasize that objects and symbols are only as important as people decide they are. The aforementioned shock symbol was also used on the back of the slipcover on the album's physical release, but the symbol here also incorporates some stylized Hebrew lettering, which spells out the Hebrew word for Leviathan, Leviathan being a particularly monstrous and animalistic form of Satan. This stylized lettering comes from the logo for LaVeyan Satanism, the founder of which, Anton LaVey, was friends with Marilyn Manson around the time he was working on this album, as well as a huge philosophical influence on the album, whom he dedicated his autobiography to. Aside from being a striking image, the lightning bolt shock logo appears in Nazi symbology and evokes the runes used in the logo for the Nazis' paramilitary police group, the SS. The tray card image features a play on Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing, The Vitruvian Man, depicting a winged, angel-like figure and surrounded, once again, by the Hebrew letters for the word Leviathan. The image resembles Manson at certain points in the video for Tourniquet. The booklet also features permutations on the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God as depicted in the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh, which can, according to some, be rearranged for use in the invocation and banishment of angels, as well as the esoteric understanding of the codes that the universe is built upon. One permutation of the letters of the Tetragrammaton, when translated into one of the polygonal forms found in the booklet for the album, creates a shape that's identical to the lightning bolt from the album's shock logo. Finally, the 4 Roman numerals that appear on the back of the slipcover and in the pages of the booklet are 9, 6, 3, and 7. The product of these 4 numbers is 1134, and if you turn this number upside down, it reads like the word hell. There's a lot more imagery in the pages of the booklet, but those are some of the most important things that appear. To conclude, Antichrist Superstar pulls together imagery, symbolism, and lyrics that conflate the American government and fundamentalist Christianity with fascism and totalitarianism, using Nazi imagery like the lightning bolt and the Sieg Heil salute, and the aesthetic of the Nuremberg rallies. The narrative of the album is a pastiche of Nietzsche's conception of evolution from apes to overmen, and uses social Darwinist sentiments to express frustration with humanity's lack of progress, and LaVeyan Satanist sentiments to remind the listener that they are their own god. Rooting itself in the industrial genre allows its lyrics and soundscape to conjure blasphemous, satanic imagery in the mind of the listeners. Finally, the artwork on the album's slipcase, covers and booklets draws on imagery of Baphomet, the name of Leviathan, and Kabbalistic understanding of the Hebrew name of God to frame the listener's interpretations of the songs contained within. This video took a lot of effort and research, so if you've watched it all the way through, thank you very much.